think I'm going to entitle this video something like The Bizarre World of Chris Eubank Jr. Let's take it back from the start. Chris Eubank Senior's son, Chris Eubank Jr., makes his debut, turns into the professional ranks after a undistinguished career in the amateurs, so we say. Initially, does a bit of work with Mick Hennessy, and if we're honest, looks very good, beating very, very little. Starts to work with Frank Warren and Box Nason, where he famously takes the massive step up against Billy Joe Saunders. At the time, I commented on numerous occasions on my channel that it was an ill-advised fight to take, and that's something I still passionately believe. For me, in terms of guiding and managing a fighter, one of the key attributes is taking the right fights at the right time. Now, an opponent could be the right opponent, but if you take that opponent at the wrong time in your career, it leads to losses. And for me, Chris Eubank Jr. versus Billy Joe Saunders was always an ill-advised move for Chris Eubank Jr. to take. Why? Because on the lead up to that fight, Chris Eubank Jr. had no experience of going rounds. I think the best opponents he'd been in with were the likes of Bradley Price and Tyan Booth and those sort of guys. And he'd really made his name knocking out guys in lower weight divisions. Knocking out guys who he'd brought up from lower weight divisions. He stepped up against Billy Joe Saunders, an undefeated amateur standout with huge technical ability and talent. And like I and many others predicted, he suffered his first loss at the hands of Billy Joe Saunders. After a few comeback fights where he started working with Eddie Hearn, and between that time with Frank Warren and Eddie Hearn, he started to amass a better level of opposition. Spike O'Sullivan, Chudanov, those sort of guys. Those are exactly the kind of fights he actually needed before the Billy Joe Saunders fight. There were then other British level fights, the likes of Nick Blackwell, unfortunately, that ended in tragic circumstances. And then we found the hype about whether or not Chris Eubank Jr. would fight Gennady Golovkin. There was the comment that he had lost his pen. There was the bizarre negotiations from Chris Eubank Sr. And bizarre demands about Barry McGuigan needing to commentate and, all of this sort of stuff. And it kind of left you with the impression that Chris Eubank Jr. was one of the most bizarrely managed fighters that you're likely to see. Eubank Jr. is a relatively young fighter, somewhere between prospect and contender level within the middleweight division. And it's arguable that he had burnt bridges with Sky, Matchroom, Eddie Hearn, Frank Warren, Box Nason, BT Sports. He'd had a run with Mick Hennessy. It kind of made you wonder, where is Chris Eubank Jr.'s next move? What is the next play? Because all of the obvious strategies, Sky, Box Nason, Hearn, Warren, Hennessy, all of the really obvious strategies had been exhausted. Now, of course, when you've got a fighter as marketable and as entertaining and as full of potential as Chris Eubank Jr., you're not going to struggle to pick up a promoter. I think Eddie Hearn suggested that despite all of the troubles and all of the pain that Eubank Jr. caused with the Golovkin fight, he would work with him again under the right circumstances. And I'm absolutely sure that's the same for Frank Warren as well. Despite all of the pain that Eubank caused Frank Warren with the Billy Joe Saunders rematches and that sort of thing, I'm sure under the right circumstances Warren would work with Eubank again, because Eubank's too much of a commodity. Outside of Anthony Joshua, in my opinion, Chris Eubank Jr. is probably the most marketable and most star potential fighter in UK boxing at present. So he's the fighter with the most star potential, so I say. But what that would have involved is a retreat from the Eubanks. What that would have involved is Senior going to Eddie Hearn and saying, look, sorry we messed you around with Golovkin, things will be different this time. It would have led to them changing their position and changing their stance and potentially admitting that they could have handled things differently. And that's a very un-Eubank-like thing to do. So what they've done is forged out a pretty bizarre and pretty unique route. So, having criticised on Twitter Billy Joe Saunders only 2 or 3 weeks ago for fighting in a leisure centre, Chris Eubank Jr. will be taking on, and you know what, I'm not even doing this for comic effect, I'm just going to have to Google the opponent's name, because I've actually forgotten it off the top of my head. Reynold Quinlan. Chris Eubank Jr. will be taking on Reynold Quinlan in a Lee Valley Leisure Centre, as I understand it. Several weeks after taking to Twitter to call out Billy Joe Saunders and to mock Billy Joe Saunders for fighting in a leisure centre, Chris Eubank Jr. himself will be fighting in a leisure centre. Now, to make things more bizarre, this comes only 12 weeks after, 20 weeks after, I forget the exact time frames, but this comes relatively soon to what would have been Chris Eubank Jr.'s career-defining fight against Gennady Golovkin. He's gone from fighting Gennady Golovkin in one of the biggest fights in world boxing on Sky Sports pay-per-view, that was sold out arena, to fighting Reynold Quinlan in a leisure centre. But the controversy doesn't stop there. This will be a new weight class for Chris Eubank Jr. He'll be moving up to super middleweight. This will be for the IBO world title that Chris Eubank Jr. has already taken to social media to claim is a very, very legit world title. He's posted pictures of, many of the well-known IBO world champions over the years: Vladimir Klitschko, Floyd Mayweather, Gennady Golovkin. I guess the difference with those guys is they have the IBO title in addition to the various other belts, whereas this would be Eubank Jr.'s first world title. For the record, certainly not a world title in my opinion. But it will also be on ITV pay-per-view, which is perhaps the most bizarre decision of all. The decision to fight Reynold Quinlan is something I cannot fathom. The decision to move up to super middleweight is something that I think is ill thought out at this stage of his career. The decision to fight at Lee Valley Leisure Centre is perplexing. The decision to go down the IBO world title route, for me, lacks credibility. But the decision to fight on ITV pay-per-view really takes the biscuit. The Eubanks, in doing this, they genuinely believe Eubank Jr. is a credible draw, but the Eubanks, in doing this, I believe, have exposed themselves to an incredible commercial risk. An incredible commercial risk that I must say has the potential to be damaging at this point and going forward in terms of his career. We're in an era where, largely due to Eddie Hearn and Matchroom, the pay-per-view model has been revived, and we're seeing fighters making very substantial amounts of money. It's well publicised that Anthony Joshua supposedly earned £3 million for a British title fight against Dillian Whyte. We're in an era now where Anthony Joshua pay-per-views can do 450,000 buys, 500,000 buys, and there's a suggestion that the Klitschko fight that's coming up will break the million buys barrier. That is the market status of pay-per-view in the UK. And you've got to say that Chris Eubank Sr. and Jr. have exposed themselves to immense risk by fighting such a poor opponent for such a poor belt at such a poor venue as their pay-per-view debut. Because who on earth is going to buy this? Let's be honest, Chris Eubank Jr. versus Reynold Quinlan is probably a worse fight than many free-to-air main events. It's certainly a worse fight than many pay-per-view undercard fights. My fear for the Eubanks here is that they could do such poor numbers on pay-per-view that firstly, it may make ITV totally retreat from the pay-per-view model. Secondly, it could be humiliating. And thirdly, it could really damage their opportunity to gain future negotiations. When they go to Eddie Hearn and say, we want X amount of million to fight Gennady Golovkin, previously they've said Chris Eubank Jr. makes the pay-per-view. Now Eddie Hearn can say, well, clearly that's not the case. You did your own pay-per-view and you sold X amount of buys. I'm used to doing pay-per-views that sell 500,000 buys. I think this was a really, really ill thought out decision here, because as part of running this YouTube channel, and it's a very small YouTube channel, I know that, but as part of running this YouTube channel, I interact with a good number at Boxing Hardcore, and I'm actually yet to come across someone who said that they're going to pay the pay-per-view to buy this fight. Now, if you will buy this fight, if you will pay however much it's going to be to watch this fight, please leave a comment in the section below. I'd be fascinated to hear from you. I'm someone who supports pay-per-view. I don't stream boxing. I am a Box Nation subscriber and I buy the vast majority of Sky Boxing pay-per-views. I believe pay-per-view has a place, and whilst I don't like paying the money, I acknowledge that certain fights won't get made without the pay-per-view model. But I won't be paying for this because it simply doesn't represent value for money. It's an opponent who I haven't seen fight before, in a fight that I don't believe to be competitive, presumably with a very limited undercard, for a belt that is probably as meaningless to most boxing fans as the one I'm wearing around my waist right now. You know, it's really something that I think has the potential to be damaging. Let's see how many pay-per-view buys these Eubanks actually do against Reynold Quinlan at a leisure centre. You know, does it do 100,000 buys? I'm highly, highly dubious. Does it do 50,000 buys? You know, I find it hard to see. Now, being on ITV are a massive platform. They do have the potential to promote this, to build hype around it, and they have the potential to hit a vast audience of casual sports fans, which may result in this not bombing quite as badly as I suspect it's going to. But in terms of asking the public to pay however much it's going to be and part with their money to see a fight at this level, I don't see it. I really, really don't see it. And what are you potentially left with? You're left with a guy in Chris Eubank Jr. who is holding a super middleweight IBO World Championship. Does having that IBO World Championship add anything? Does that add any weight in the eyes of anyone within boxing? Not for me. I mean, those with long memories may remember when Chris Eubank Jr. was the WBA champion of the interim, as Eubank Sr. used to call it, when he used that as an excuse not to fight Billy Joe Saunders because he wouldn't want to vacate the championship of the interim. You know, for me, it's farcical. It's of that nature. And as for Eubank Jr. at 168, I have real question marks as to whether the guy will be as effective a fighter at 168 as he is at 160 pounds. Eubank Jr. has never been the biggest power puncher in terms of one-punch knockout. The guy clearly has a lot of sting and a lot of zip behind his punches, but I view him as a guy who beats his opponents by overwhelming them, by outmanning them, by basically running them over. And you've got to wonder, 160 to 168 is a big, big gap. You're dealing with men in the 168 pound division who are legit big guys. Guys like George Groves, guys like Callum Smith, guys like Rocky Fielding. You know, these are big men. These are guys who are 6 foot plus. These are guys who are 13 and a half, 14 stone outside of the ring. You know, Eubank Jr. is a very, very strong, athletic guy. But if you actually look at him in terms of his frame, whilst he's extremely well conditioned, and I've met Chris Eubank Jr., but whilst he's extremely well conditioned, Chris Eubank Jr. is not a bloke who's 6 foot tall. I know BoxRec has him at 5'11". I think he's a bit shorter than that. He's someone who's got a slender, natural physique. I think Chris Eubank Jr. looks very small compared to a George Groves or a Callum Smith, and those are big guys at the division. Don't get me wrong. I'm using the bigger guys to prove the point. But at £168, will he be the same force? Will he be able to? I don't think he's got the one-punch knockout power even at 160. So I think he's going to rely on overwhelming opponents and out-strengthening opponents and running them over, as I say. That's how I view his style. Will that style be as effective when you step up in weight class by more than half a stone? I'm not so sure. 160 is a... If he has genuine ambitions to fight a Billy Joe Saunders or to fight a Gennady Golovkin, 160 is the division to be in. Now, £168 is a very, very attractive division. That George Groves fight is potentially there. We've spoken about that on my channel before, and very foreseeably that is a fight that could be made, given that both are seemingly free agents. The James DeGale fight, that's always one that I thought would be very attractive. Is that potentially there? These fights are on the horizon, but for me, these are fights that are potentially very, very tough fights for Chris Eubank Jr. to win. It'll be interesting to see how he looks against this opponent. But I just find it a very, very perplexing decision. Very perplexing decision for me. Eubank Jr. has always been someone who's big at the weight. He's always been someone who's struggled to get down to 160. I think I've seen him on 2 or 3 occasions actually miss weight at the initial weigh-in. Only by an ounce here and an ounce there, and he's been able to lose it. But he's a very, very big guy for 160. As he's getting older, it's going to get harder. And now having a fight at £168, I think that's going to make it much, much, much more difficult to get down to 160 again in future. So I think you're potentially limiting your options in terms of weight class. I think you're potentially limiting your options in terms of marketability and negotiation standpoint if you do a pay-per-view and the pay-per-view buys are so horrifically poor that it affects your commercial stance in terms of negotiations. And I also think that he may just not be the force at 168 that he was at 160. The guys are going to be much stronger. His power is going to affect them less. And his style, where he really imposes himself, may be one that was more effective where he was the naturally bigger guy against smaller middleweights. That's my perspective here. I think it's a questionable decision. Eubank Jr. could be signed with Hennessy. He could be signed with Warren. He could be signed with Hearn. He could be fighting on Sky. He could be fighting on Sky pay-per-view. He could be fighting on Box Nation. He could be fighting on BT Sports. All these were legit, solid options to Chris Eubank Jr. He could be looking at a rematch with Billy Joe Saunders, which would be a massive pay-per-view event for a version of the middleweight world title. He could be fighting Gennady Golovkin for the unified middleweight world title, which would be a massive pay-per-view fight. Winning either of those would cement some sort of legacy, would provide world championship status legitimately, not the IBO version. It would provide wealth from a single fight that would allow him to retire and quit boxing if he decided that was the route he wanted to take. What he is actually now doing is fighting at a different weight class in a leisure centre for the IBO title on a pay-per-view platform that's completely untested, and for me represents the equivalent of flipping a coin. Could it go well? Possibly. Could it go badly? Very possibly. And for me, a commercial failure in a pay-per-view of this nature has the potential to be very, very damaging going forward for Chris Eubank Jr. I don't know how many other fighters that I can recollect since I've been following boxing who have been managed so bizarrely. Now, Eubank Sr. knows the sport a lot better than I do. Maybe he's worked it out. Maybe he's got it cracked. Maybe there's some master plan that is going to come together. maybe, God only knows, ITV will promote Chris Eubank Jr. to the casuals, and he'll end up successfully flogging 500,000 pay-per-view buys and make 10 million quid out of the fight. Maybe all of those things are possibilities that I'm overlooking. But right now, whilst Chris Eubank Jr.'s career inside and outside of the ring remains extremely intriguing, I, for one, am very confused. I cannot work out what on earth is going on with him. And I'm unclear if the reason that we're watching this fight is actually because this is what they believe to be the best route, or it's because they burnt their bridges with all the major boxing broadcasters, all the major boxing promoters. They burnt their bridges with Golovkin. They burnt their bridges with Eubank, with Billy Joe Saunders. And rather than having to go back to one of those failed negotiations and say, look, we hold our hands up, we messed up, rather than take a backward step, rather than admit you were wrong, they've had to roll the dice and gamble on something completely new. I'm uncertain. Let me know your thoughts, people. What's your take on this very, very bizarre situation? Is Eubank Sr. an evil genius? Or is this just a product of not wanting to go back and admit that they were wrong and taking the hit to the ego? Leave your comments in the section below. If you've enjoyed the video, please take the time to hit the thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, please press subscribe so you can check out all my other stuff. As always, links to my social media, to my Facebook, to my Twitter, are in the comments section or in the description section below the video. Thanks a lot for watching.